industrial accidents,
ancient
solving
poisoners,
crime,
poison
chemical
prevention.
spills. This is Toxic History.
Dr. Sarah Coffey graduated from the University of Findlay College of Pharmacy and has been with the Central Ohio Poison Center for 4 years, serving as a certified specialist in poison information. Thank you so much, Dr. Coffey.
Thank you for that introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about sharing the story of Dr. Robert Buchanan. Some quick objectives that we're going to hit just kind of throughout the talk. The first is just going to be reviewing opioids and the uses and mechanisms. We're going to talk about the effects of atropine and how uniquely this applies to this story. And then this is one of the first cases where expert witnesses are really used a lot in the trial that occurs in the story. So we're going to discuss kind of the impact of expert witnesses in general. So Dr. Robert Buchanan, he was born in Scotland in 1862. He then moved to Nova Scotia and started his career kind of as a druggist clerk. In 1883, he graduated from the Chicago College of Physicians and Surgeons. And then he settled down to practice in New York in 1887, where he married his first wife, Helen, and they had one daughter together. A few years after this, he met Anna Sutherland. She was a keeper of a notorious brothel in Newark, and she also owned a large amount of land. She was very wealthy for this time period, and she and Dr. Buchanan fell in love, and she urged Dr. Buchanan to divorce his wife and to marry her. So on November 12th in 1890, he did divorce his first wife. Shortly after November 27th, Anna signed him into her will, and then they married in secret just 2 days after that. Anna then moved from Newark, left her job as the brothel owner, and moved back with Dr. Buchanan to live with him. Right around this time period, there was another trial going on for Carlisle Harris. He was a New York medical student at the time, and in 1890, he was found guilty of murdering his wife with morphine. Initially, they related the cause of death to a stroke or cerebral epilepsy is what they called it. But on examination of the body, the pupils of the deceased were noted to be very pinpoint, and that really pointed them towards opioids as the cause of death. Harris was arrested. He was found guilty of murdering his wife, and then he was executed. This is important because Dr. Buchanan followed this case very closely, and he called Carlisle Harris a bungling fool and a stupid amateur for not being able to conceal the traces of morphine that he had administered to his wife. He said it was a very easy thing for a doctor to do, one who's familiar with drugs, to get rid of his wife, and he stated that he knew how to avoid the telltale pinpoint pupils. So Anna and Dr. Buchanan's marriage, initially it was going very well, mostly due to Anna's money. So Dr. Buchanan's practice at that point was really prosperous in New York, but eventually a lot of his clients found out that he had married this brothel owner, and that was really not good for business. They all started to kind of leave his practice. So there was a lot of resentment that formed between him and his wife because of this, and he began to hate his wife. He talked to his friends about it, and he would threaten to just dump the old woman. And then in April of 1892, Anna was kind of fed up with this and threatened to move back to Newark and return to running that brothel. Unfortunately for her, on April 22nd, she fell ill, and then she died just 1 day later, and the cause of death was ruled as a stroke. Now, suspiciously, on May 16th, less than a month later, Dr. Buchanan remarried his first wife, Helen. In May of 1892, just a little bit after that, there was a New York reporter by the name of Ike White. He worked for New York World, and he started to hear rumors surrounding the sudden death of the brothel owner. Friends of the deceased were convinced that she had been poisoned by her husband, specifically to acquire her fortune of $50,000, which doesn't seem like a lot of money, but today that would be worth about $1.8 million. So it is quite a large sum. White discovered the remarks that Dr. Buchanan had made during the trial of Carlisle Harris, and he became a lot more suspicious of Anna's death, and he really started a very noisy campaign in the newspaper, and he demanded the exhumation of Anna's body. So 44 days after the burial, on June 25th, the body was exhumed. There was no trace of a stroke on re-examination, and analysis of the stomachs resulted in findings of morphine. So just a quick review, morphine is an opiate. It's derived from the poppy plant. Binds primarily to the mu-opioid receptors, the mu-1 receptor generally causing the analgesic effect and euphoric effect, and the mu-2 receptor causing respiratory depression, bradycardia. It also binds in the CNS or the central nervous system and causes those pinpoint pupils or miosis that's classic with opioid use. Now, this time period, this was really not a restricted drug. We didn't really get restrictions on it until about 1914, so several years after this all happened. And most of those restrictions actually didn't come until about the 1970s. We do have an antidote for it now, naloxone, very well known, but unfortunately at this point in time that was not around. Really, we didn't get FDA approval for that until 1971, so much, much later. Like I mentioned earlier, this is one of the first cases that really relied heavily on forensic science testimony in the courtroom. Expert witnesses in the courtroom, they really have a role of analyzing evidence, conducting their own research, and forming an opinion. They help in the courtroom to kind of understand technical concepts and to make informed decisions. And their testimony can be really helpful in clarifying evidence and then validating legal arguments. And this is especially important when it comes to complex topics like forensics. So the trial for Dr. Buchanan started March 20th of 1893 in New York, just under a year from when Anna passed away. Our chief defense lawyers in the case were Charles Brooke and William O'Sullivan, and then our chief prosecutors were DeLance Nichol, James Osborne, and Francis Williman. We also had two expert witnesses that we're going to focus on in this trial. We had a toxicologist by the name of Rudolph Whithouse, who was working with the prosecution against Dr. Buchanan. And then we have Professor Victor Vaughn, who was working with the defense at the time. So Whithouse, he analyzed the organs of Anna. He stated in his testimony that he hashed the organs, then purified and reduced this hash as much as possible. He took the remaining substance and then put it through 6 different color reaction tests for morphine. These reagents in the reaction, when morphine is added to them, turn a very characteristic color. And all of the tests responded positively for the presence of morphine in this case. He then conducted an experiment in the courtroom with a frog, where he injected the frog with morphine and then ran the color test and concluded that unquestionably there was morphine present in Anna's organs. He stated that the body contained 1/10 of a grain of morphine, and he estimated that to be the residue of a fatal overdose of 5 to 6 grains. He was questioned by the chief prosecuting counsel, Francis Williman, who asked Whithouse if he knew any means possible to disguise the pinpoint pupils that are characteristic of morphine poisoning. Whithouse referred to his original report, stating the treatment of the eyes with atropine might very well eliminate the narrowing of pupils, which otherwise follows morphine poisoning. He then demonstrated this in the courthouse. So just a quick review, atropine, it's derived from the belladonna plant. It competitively blocks the effects of acetylcholine, and it induces the mydriasis by inhibiting the contraction of your circular pupillary sphincter muscle, which is normally stimulated by the acetylcholine. So with that inhibition, it allows the countering muscle, the radial pupillary dilator muscle, to contract and pull those pupils open. To demonstrate the effects of the atropine, Whithouse brought a cat into the courtroom, and in front of the jury, the cat was injected with a fatal dose of morphine. They then added atropine eye drops to the cat's eyes after it died. The jury was able to see the cat's pupils dilate after the overdose, similar to the effects that they would have seen with Anna's body. Whithouse was then cross-examined by the chief defense lawyer, Sullivan, who was an ex-doctor turned attorney. He asked Whithouse if the color reaction test was especially important for demonstrating the presence of morphine, which Whithouse agreed that it was, but also stressed that there were several other tests that needed to provide corroboration with the results. O'Sullivan then asked if it were possible that an alkaloid from a decaying body could produce a similar reaction, which Whithouse stated that really at that point had not been observed, so no. O'Sullivan then called Professor Victor Vaughn to the stand, and Vaughn discussed that the color tests that were used could provide false positives. And to demonstrate this in the courtroom, he used a pancreas, which had been decaying for several weeks, and replicated the color test that Whithouse had presented with the frog. but he did this using the same test tubes that Whithouse had used. Other witnesses stated afterwards that this demonstration was very sloppily done, and there was concern for cross-contamination with the tubes that contained morphine. But ultimately, when the test was done in the courtroom, it did obtain a positive reaction for the morphine tube as well as the pancreas tube, and that seemed to have a very profound impact on the jury. So some other testimony that was not expert witness but was important to the case. The first one was a nurse who testified. She worked closely with Anna right before her passing. She stated that she saw Dr. Buchanan administering eye drops to his wife during her final hours. And then O'Sullivan encouraged Dr. Buchanan to testify for himself. He felt that it had gone against Harris during his trial to not testify, but unfortunately, Buchanan's testimony was described as very self-obsessed and kind of whining, and it really only worsened under cross-examination. It became much more exaggerated. Prosecutor Williman kind of trapped him in a lot of lies and contradictions, and the testimony kind of canceled out any doubt that was created by the scientific dispute. So the jury deliberated, and after about 24 hours, they found Buchanan guilty on April 28th, and this was just after, like 1 year after Anna's death. There was an appeal. Dr. Buchanan's lawyers launched an appeal based on that tainted scientific evidence from the case, and Whithouse was able to provide evidence that Vaughn's methodology was flawed. He tracked the source of the error to the impurities in the chemicals in the courtroom demonstration. Ultimately, that appeal failed, and Dr. Buchanan was sentenced to death. He was electrocuted on July 2nd, 1895. And that is the story of Dr. Robert Buchanan.